seminar. And can we begin your presentation?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Right. Hello, everyone. I am very excited to be part of this group, and I will explain why as I go further. I'd like to start by saying a few words about why I have come to this topic. I am a historian of 19th and 20th century Orissa, and my particular interest at the moment around this particular work is focused on the idea of the political in Odisha. And this is, I sense that by the 19th and 20th century, the idea of the political in Orissa is something very specific to Odisha, given the kind of complex political landscape that Odisha has, with the mix of British Orissa nationalism as well as the princely states. And that's what I'm interested in thinking through as a 19th and 20th century historian. Recently, scholars like Pritipuspa Banerjee and Milinda Banerjee have talked about the idea of the political in Bengal in the 19th century. Pritipuspa Banerjee has suggested that we look beyond the philosophical or these kind of big intellectual history texts for our understanding of the idea of the political in India. My own interest has to do with the ways in which the public, the people, understand the relationships of power within the political sphere, how they understand their position as subjects and citizens in relation to those who rule, their position as the ruled. And for us to arrive at that understanding, we need to go beyond intellectual history and arrive at a more publicly relevant tradition of power and authority. And it is because of this I decided to look at ideas about politics, about authority, and about responsibility in pre-colonial Orissa. So therefore, it is my interest in thinking about the political aesthetics of Bhakti is a way to mine into more local, more particular histories of the political. Right. So this is my intention. And by setting it up like this, what I'm trying to say is that my venture into pre-colonial Orissa is a very new one for me. Both the genre of the text I'm looking at, the Puranas, as well as the century, the 18th century, are mostly unfamiliar to me. And it is because of this reason that I am very grateful to be part of this community of scholars who are well-versed in pre-colonial Odia as well as other language texts. The paper I'm going to present today has more questions than answers. And I would like to echo Professor Patnaik's comments about where I feel I am at in this project very, very early. So I'm kind of thinking through what can be done and how can we do this project. I'm hoping that the conversations that arise from after this paper will help me kind of carve out a way forward in this project. Now, my overall task, what I want to do in the longer project, is to explore whether there's a consistent political aesthetics of Bhakti in early modern Odia Puranas. Now, a number of Puranas of this period mention kind of elaborate different notions of kingship in terms of rajaniti, rajadharma, rajapana. And I want to see if all of these, a reading of all of these, throw into relief some commonly held ideas about the political that are particular to 18th century Odisha. I will take the Madhava Dasa's Moksha Purana, written in the end of the 18th century, as my point of departure. And in the paper going forward, I will talk a little bit about the Moksha Purana, but then lay out two key conceptual questions that will inform my task ahead. One is that how do we use the idea of political aesthetics, which is a very modern, very mid-20th century idea, and apply it to a period that doesn't seem to be engaging with precisely the questions that the idea of political aesthetics brings up from the mid-20th century. So how do we do that? Is it ahistorical in some ways? Is it a problematic borrowing of a concept? Secondly, how do we read these Puranas as texts that are giving us information about the idea of the political that is particular to the 18th century? Because these texts have something in them that is both timeless, because they're drawing from earlier traditions of narrative and idiom, etc. But also, is there something timely about them? what are the ways in which we can find the 18th centuryness of these texts? That is the big question. These are both anxieties that historians would bring into the scene, because we are worried about kind of timeliness of texts and conclusions. So to start with, I want to kind of give you a brief narrative of Madhava Dasa's Moksha Purana. But before doing that, I want to also talk a little bit about why I have chosen it as my point of departure. I've chosen it because the newest of the texts of 18th century Odia Puranas. It is at the end of the 18th century, so it probably, I'm hoping, carries traces of the early Puranas that were significantly more successful than this one. So the Nrusingha Purana of the mid-18th century, and the other kind of big Puranas of the earlier period. So perhaps starting from here and going backwards will allow me to track more of the common tropes. Secondly, in this text, it's very clear that the discussion of the political is a lot more urgent, because the text starts as a kind of Purana about moksha, but it ends with a list of rulers who rule the land. And that list runs into the history of the Marathas and the history of the British. So there is a way in which this text is engaging with the question of alien rule and trying to explain it within terms of Bhakti Moksha, where these rulers are somehow not the right kind of rulers. And it is using the kind of conclusions it has drawn from the early part of the text to show how the British Raja is not the best kind of Raja, even though he rules with a lot of thought and care. So that also makes this text a particularly interesting point of departure, because it is so on the surface, this idea of the political is so on the surface for this text. So for the purposes of the paper, I want to quickly draw out a story about a particular episode in the text, where we find a king in conversation with a muni in a forest. The story begins with a hunter who is good at catching parrots, suapoki. And this is why I mentioned suapoki in the comments a few minutes ago. And he sells the suapoki he has two suapokis, and he sells one to a muni who lives in the forest. And the muni is a very kind of religious, dharmic person who treats his guests really well. And because he is so generous, there's a way in which he doesn't have to worry about wealth. Wealth just comes to him because he is so dharmic. As opposed to a choro, a kind of dacoita, who lives in the forest in a small hut nearby. The hunter sends his other suapoki to this dacoita, who basically kills people and takes their riches from them. One day, a king comes into the forest for a hunt, runs after Mriga, and gets lost and gets separated from his army and has no protection. And he comes upon, in fear, this one, the hut of the dacoita, and hears the suapoki of the dacoita calling out and saying, "Oh, here's a rich man, let's kill him and take his wealth." And that becomes a kind of warning for him, and he runs away from that house. And then he runs towards the motto of the muni, and there he finds the other suapoki who says, here's a guest, let's feed him and let's take care of him. And that's how he enters into that hut. And the muni takes care of him, and then he thanks the muni and says, "Your suapoki is so much better than the other suapoki. It has better ethics." And the suapoki reprimands him and says, "No, you cannot blame that suapoki. It is about what sangat you keep. That defines your ethics." And the muni steps in and says, "But why did you get lost in the forest in the first place?" And the king says, "It's because I was running after this deer." And the muni reprimands the king again, saying, "Why should you hunt? What has that deer done to you?" And a long conversation kind of ensues. And as a result of that conversation, the king is disabused of certain notions of what is Kshatriya behavior. And he realizes that Kshatriya dharma is not in killing animals and using your weapons. It is in taking care of your praja properly and kind of protecting animals that are innocent. So that's the kind of story. That's a small part of the story here. And from this story, there are a few tropes that emerge. And I'm just giving an example of a couple of tropes that one could take and search for in earlier texts. First is the idea of the forest. The forest is seen here as a kind of protean space, a space before kind of power, where the authority of the king is somehow unstable. It is part of his common, where he can hunt, but he is not in control, he's not safe there. And because his authority is unstable, it becomes a place where kingship itself can be rethought for him, can be destabilized for him. It's also a place of learning if you think about Varnashrama dharma and the fact that the Muni actually has a motto where he's teaching students. And again, the authority here, therefore, is the teacher rather than the king. And it is here that the king returns to an earlier state, a younger state, and he's then schooled in what it is to be a proper Kshatriya king. So the kind of the use of the forest is something that I would be interested in tracking in different other texts, whether that's where there's a kind of destabilizing of power and power is redefined in important ways, and whether the city or the nagari, etc., are seen as places where power has crystallized and is no longer unstable. The other trope is the idea of the hunt, which again recurs in various kinds of texts. And here the idea of the hunt is seen as a distraction, a mirage that takes him unawares. However, the idea of the hunt is also critiqued in a way that allows him to kind of undermine the received notions of Kshatriya duty. That Kshatriya dharma does not lie in the killing of innocent animals. Now, this is an example of two tropes that I could track and search for in other texts. There is a lot more going on in the Moksha Purana. Some of that I will mention when I talk about the task ahead in terms of how I am planning to develop this project further. Now, what I need to do, therefore, is to unpack the major tropes of the Moksha Purana, but also track them for any resonances with other Odia Puranas of the 18th century. But this raises two conceptual anxieties as a historian looking at these texts. And I've mentioned them earlier. The first anxiety is, how do we carry over the idea of political aesthetics into the pre-colonial? What if it carries baggage from the 20th century that we shouldn't be applying? Now, the first moment in which the kind of aestheticization of politics is talked about is by Walter Benjamin, who talks about mid-20th century fascism in Europe and shows how aesthetics is used to delude the masses into accepting certain kinds of politics. Here, for Benjamin, politics and aesthetics are two different domains, and one has been kind of used as a sleight of hand. Now, Jacques Rancière much later argues that there isn't a separation between the aesthetics and the political, that politics is aesthetic in principle, because, and I quote, politics is the framing of what is given and what we can see. So it's the framing is the aesthetic process, and through it, you can do politics. So a good example of this, which doesn't affect any of you other than me, is Brexit, where British sovereignty and British development is seen either as Brexit as a kind of seeing the world as a kind of an other of Britain, and Britain needs to be free, or you can reframe it and see as those who argue for kind of Britain remaining in the EU, that Britain has this kind of global brotherhood and it belongs in this collective. So there's one truth, but how it's being framed is what politics is what enables politics. And it is here in this idea of framing of what is given, what we can see, that we can sneak in the possibility of a political aesthetic of Bhakti. Because if we look at Bhakti thought itself as the framing of what is given, what we can see. So for instance, in Moksha Purana, I know I have 39 seconds. Can I take 2 more minutes and I can wrap it up? So when we take Moksha Purana, for instance, the Purana actually is framed around the question of moksha. And it starts with this idea that, how will I achieve moksha if I'm kind of so focused on this world and wealth and power, etc. In the other world, there is no such wealth and power, that I have become distracted. And that becomes the framing to explain why kingship needs to be redefined in better ways, in ways that are more protective, more socially conscious, and more supportive of the weakest in society, the most innocent in society. And while Moksha frames the question of the other world, there's also the framing of Dharma as the framing of this world, where it frames the question of this world by talking about whether, if we get too tied up into moksha and dharma as such, and dharmic behavior, are we also in some ways in danger of losing dhana? And by talking about the Muni as someone who doesn't have to worry about dhana because God takes care of his dhana, that kind of framing allows for this idea of politics to exist, because it may not make financial sense for the king to give away the wealth to all the people, but this kind of framing enables that. And it's important to think about this idea of dharma, especially from the perspective of our discussion of the polite world of bhakti, because some of that discussion is about a kind of merchant business class thinking about wealth and thinking about community and society. The other question, and I think, I'll take one more minute. I'm so sorry. The other question is, how do we claim these as 18th century texts? We can't claim that simply because they're written in the 18th century. To put it differently, how do these ideas of rajaniti, rajapana, rajadharma present themselves as particularly 18th century ideas rather than revisitations of early bhakti traditions? Now, in the readings that I've done on kind of Odia literary history, there are discussions of how Sarala Mahabharata already is talking of kingship in these terms. So that's already something that they have available to them. So there is something kind of timeless about these Puranas. They're not just 18th century texts. Now, to deal with this issue, I propose that we approach Puranas as fables. In the scholarship on fables, there's a recognition that there's a timeless and timely element in fables. Separating our Purana fables, therefore, will use older tropes to address new problems and questions. Separating fable from fact, for a want of a better word, requires us to not read these Puranas in isolation. It is not enough to stay within the Purana literary tradition. We need to triangulate the discussion of these texts, in these texts, with more other contemporary genres of texts. In the case of the 18th century Purana, we are fortunate that we have a bigger corpus of early modern secular literature that is emergent. Hence, exploring the resonances between these Puranas and the work of Brajanath Prodajena or Upendra Bhanja will allow us to separate fable from fact. That's where I'll end. Any questions? Again, any suggestions would be very welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Preeti. That was an extremely interesting paper. I would request the questions now, but let me begin with one thought. I was, even as you're talking about the timelessness of the Puranas, I was thinking of how timed we can think of the concept, the aesthetic of hunting itself. Because when you look at Mahabharata and Ramayana, there are episodes of, I can't exactly state when they were, at what point the writing was done and how it was revised later. The concept of hunting is never considered as something which will go against rajadharma. But I was thinking, is it a Buddhist influence which makes which peters into even bhakti, which makes killing of animals wrong and hence against rajadharma?
Yeah,
because killing was not against rajadharma at certain point, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
But at this point, it has become against rajadharma.
Yeah.
So the timeliness of Puranas, that is what I wanted to point out. Thank you so much for the paper. It was very interesting. Can we go to the next questions? We have very less time. So maybe two questions.
Yeah.
Siddharth, you have a question or? Siddharth, we can't hear you. Please unmute your microphone.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Priti. That's a wonderful schema. That's a wonderful framework that you have there. And I do understand that you plan to develop it further in the directions that you have said. I have two or three thoughts. One, see, in this text and possibly in the other ones as well, the the point is, how is the king seen? If we
Yeah,
want to talk about a political aesthetics
yeah,
in these texts, so how is the king seen or visualized?
yeah.
Who gets to see him? And the king is basically an erring subject who gets to learn something.
Yeah,
So the king as a kind of a pupil, and this pupil king who is seen as a kind of an erring and then coming to the right point or the right way of looking at things. So that's one kind of a image which comes through one kind of a way in which the king is seen, and who is being or who is educating.
yeah,
The education is not happening from a space, and I would a little later connect it to the wonderful way in which you think of, you conceptualize that forest as a space where the authority is momentarily suspended. The kingly authority needs to be suspended so that the pedagogical intervention can happen. Uh, so the educator is, how do we see the educator? Here in this context, it's a rishi. Generally, the two contexts in which political education is provided, either it's Rishma, who is tutoring Yudhishthir, or it's Hiranyakashipu, who tries to, or it's Nrusingha. I'm a little less sure there, who is tutoring Prahlad. Uh, so here, the image of the educator is deliberately kept very lowbrow, very not as elevated as somebody like Bhishma, right? Uh, so that's the other thought that I had. Like, it's if it's basically about how the king is seen, then it's also about this pupil king and the tutor.
yeah,
So that's something you may find interesting. The other point that I had is, and I'd definitely like to listen to you about it if we have the time, and I'm sure you have thought about these things as well. Um the other wonderful point that you made is about the wealth creation and violence, or authority over violence. These are the two, if we say, cornerstones of kingship, in a sense, that the king has the command over
yeah,
violence, and the king is the wealth creator. And we did not forget that during this point in time, uh, many of these kings were traders as well. Historically speaking, they were involved
yeah,
in trading. So, on the one hand, as you rightly pointed out, they are being divested of these two functions which keep them tied to the earth, so that the education can happen. So, in a sense, uh, so they need to be removed from, the king needs to be away from these two functions, insofar as a space can be created where he would receive the education. Uh, so, and if I remember right, the violence that is being spoken about, it's also a violence, not only the violence of paridhi, or a venturing into the jungle as such, but violence is also there, a very local petty violence. Uh,
yeah,
like in the sense it's a very generalized kind of a, it's not a glorified kind of a violence that
Yeah.
is being asked to refrain from. So
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah, your thoughts, please.
This is brilliant. Thank you so much. I hadn't thought about the lowbrowness. That's actually brilliant. Thank you. So just to answer quickly, Dr. Professor Mishra's question about killing in Rajadharma. This is something that when I was reading about early bhakti in Orissa, so it's starting at the kind of Bhagavad and Mahabharat phase, scholars, literary scholars in writing in Odia have claimed that this shift is already happening at that time. There's already a moment in the Sarada Mahabharat, for instance, where kingship is shifting. And there's a new notion of kingship, a kinder, gentler, parental almost patriarchal kingship that is emerging in this time. And there's a push away from war and away from killing. That killing is not the rationale for kingship. And this is why I decided to actually focus on the hunt, because that was my understanding too, that the hunt was this Kshatriya thing that you did. And and to bring in what Siddharthi was saying about how is the king seen and described, there's a certain kind of almost glorifying of the king's body and how he does the hunt, right? In these early, there's a description of that kind of the physicality of the hunt. And in this text, that description is at a minimum. So it's just literally half a sentence of, he's dressed in this and ready for battle, and he runs off. And so it's very kind of straightforward and kind of skipped over. And it is more his errantness that is described in greater detail rather than the kind of glorification of the hunt as this trope. So that is, to me, very interesting, that shift. So I will think more about how is the king seen, but who sees the king? And in this, I was thinking also about the hearer of these texts, because the reader is unimportant in these texts. The author kind of just is talking to the shrotas. They're saying suno, suno, and with care, etc. So they are being shown this new vision of the king, the errant king, and there is something about making the king errant in this very kind of unsophisticated way, without kind of dressing it up in any way. That makes for the shrotas as well a certain allows them to have political critique and a space for anger about politics, and there is a reason for that in the late 18th century as well. So thinking about how the educator, therefore, is being chosen as a lowbrow person may be about engaging the public into that conversation. Because this is some Christian notes, I'm going to kill his last name, who writes about bhakti and it's public. What he's trying to say there is that the bhakti public is a public of reception. And it's always a public. It's never an individual. It's always a collective. So making the critical person, making the educator lowbrow, is also making the educator common to and accessible to this kind of reception audience that is claiming. So that may be what is happening, but that's a very quick response. I may want to think a bit more about that lowbrow. So thank you. That was very insightful. And also insightful is this idea that wealth creation and control over violence, the ownership of violence, so to speak, the only legitimate violence that can be in the state is perpetrated by the ruler or by the king, taking that away. That moment to me, and this may be a historian's bias, so I will correct it as I go forward, is to think about what's happening in the late 18th century. Because it is not simply that there are kind of these trader kings who are trading, and obviously the story of salt and sovereignty that is going on in this period of time. There's quite a lot of really good scholarship on that. But you also have the Marathas, and the Marathas are genuinely bad kings because it's an occupation. It is not a rule. They take taxes, but they don't do the governance. So there's a way in which the example of bad kingship, the example of taking wealth away, perpetrating violence without the responsibilities already there and has genuine impact on people's lives. And then comes this new kind of king who's
Yeah.
very thoughtful, right? Who uses legal language, is careful, but at the same time kills animals and eats them. So this is the critique of the new kind of king. So in some ways, thinking about wealth creation, and this new kind of king is also basically a trader, is about, I think, engaging with these unstable political circumstances of the 18th century and trying to figure out where they sit in some ways. That's my answer. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Priti. And I think we got one more question. Yeah, Sukanya Sarvadhikari's question. I'm just reading it out. Can we also think of Dr. Mishra's arguments in the light of the householder king, the householder in parenthesis king and renouncer problem, such that this remains not only about a critique of the ruler, but the salience of the renouncer?
Yes.
And I think you can read it. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Sukanya. This is a more complex question than I have thought, so I will give you a kind of quick response to it. There is a way in which I think in a lot of these, in the early part of the text when I was reading, the bit where the bandhana happens, and which is talking more about moksha, and it's talking about precisely the householder, because the householder is saying to God, what do I do? I have kind of gotten so mired in this world, in wealth generation, but also in looking after my son, like thinking of his success, my legacy in this world. My worldliness has become so intense that I have lost all jnana. And I have lost all jnana and I will not have moksha. So save me, God, save me. That is the kind of first narrative. And in some ways, the rest of the text seems to be about you don't have to renounce it. And this is why I think it is part of the polite world of bhakti and a kind of merchant tradition, because it is not a renunciative bhakti text. It is asking not to renounce, rather to kind of have a transcendental dharmicness in the present. That you can give away wealth, but the wealth will be generated because there is a God that will take care of you because you have done your dharma. And that's almost like a band-aid. I mean, when I read it, it feels like a band-aid because I think of philanthropy and the kind of tax returns of philanthropy. That's what it sounded like to me. So there is a continued commitment to not renouncing in this text. But the only renouncer here is actually the Muni. But I don't know what to do with that. So thank you for asking that question. I think I need to think a lot more.
I think one more question. This is from Ujan Ghosh. More of a commentary really. In 18th century and 17th century Odia text, kingship is practically aestheticized through the category of bhoga instead of tyaga, for example, which dominates kingship otherwise in literature. Most kings in Odia poetry, Chandrabhanu in Lavanyavati, for example, or his father is an able king and their kingdoms are underlined by excesses. Is there a room for thought for the category of bhoga?
Yes. If I'm not wrong, is bhanje also bhoga? Or have I misunderstood those two terms? Because that's a term that that he rests in bhanje. Like that's a term that keeps coming back in the text about bhoga. So there is actually room for this category because it is a category that seems to kind of constantly recur in this text. And it's not so much about... So the only good guy here is the Muni. And the Muni seems to not do bhoga and not sort of worry about it, right? He feeds other people, but he's not renouncing anything, but he's not worried about it. But when he describes the kings, especially the list of kings at the end of the text, every one of them is they have thrived and they've done bhoga, and then they've taken care of their people, so they survived. And then they haven't taken care of their people. The criticisms are about whether they've taken care of the people or not. But bhoga itself doesn't seem to be a wrong thing at all. It seems to be justified for the kings, and that is not what is going to undermine their dharma or their possibility of their dhana or moksha at all. So it would be interesting to actually think through what bhoga means. And again, that would bring us back to this idea of wealth generation, merchant class, thinking about enterprise in the late 18th century. That seems to hold this all together. I hope that
And
answers the question.
also in addition to that, just to extend Preeti's point, uh, both bhoga and bhunjiva, the two terms, you need to, you also, your karma phala, you also bhoga.
Yeah, yeah,
You do the consequences of karma. You also do bhogiva darkar. That's the term, or bhoganti. That's the term. Generally, the point. So here, bhoga, in the sense, the two senses in which it is operating. On the one hand, it's something that you. It has a connotation of your might, your excesses, your sensory pleasure, sensory gratifications in that sense. The other sense it also has, that you cannot escape the consequences of your action. You have to live out them. So, bhoga in the sense that you live out the consequences of your actions. So, here, I think quite legitimate a question to think about how kingship is connected with bhoga, and
yes.
also not to forget. I think Upendra Vanja's grandfather Dhananjaya Vanja, who's presenting himself through that category of bhoga in some of his lines, which I cannot quote exactly here. But how he enjoys the company of women, that's the point he's there in the context of bhoga.
There's a direct reference to that in this book of bad kingship is if you forced women,
Yeah,
that's bad kingship. So that's really interesting. So
that's, yeah, yeah. So thank you, Jan, for raising this question, and it's quite pertinent. So, if we do not have any further questions, may we? Uh, I think we have lost Professor Mishra.
I'm
Uh,
here.
can you? I think we some connections issues and all. So yeah, okay. I
Okay.
think she's.
So, how do you, which etymology do you draw it from? And how it has been drawn, why? Can make an important connection also.
Uh,
Prasad, Bhogo.
Ah, yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
So,
we
how do
lost.
you
We missed the first
draw
part
the
of your first parts of your words, first parts of your sentences.
so, very interesting paper, Dr. Preeti. But and I think we can have more discussions over later over some of these issues. But I'm sorry we have to move on to the next paper now. Thank you very much,
Thank you so
very
much.
much.